Okay, this is another video dealing with another uh, popular YouTube atheist who thinks he has a kind of a certain spin here on the historical Jesus. He says if Jesus really did exist, which is a question there, if Jesus really did exist, he would be appalled at what was tacked on to him later. So I guess this is AronRA, a very popular YouTube atheist. I guess he knows what Jesus would think better than Jesus' own earliest first generation, second generation followers. So we got the power of mind reading here, what Jesus actually would think of these things that have been tacked onto him later on. Um, I just, how can we take these atheists seriously? How can we take these? I'm going to go through this video here, and I want to point out some just basic errors. Again, just basic errors. If he had done some basic study outside, he's going to have his main people. He's going to run through the litany here. He's going to compare Jesus to Santa Claus. He's going to compare Jesus to Hercules. He's going to compare Jesus to Thor. He's going to compare Jesus to all these other pagan mythology, just like all the others do. And his main sources he's going to cite on here, some of his main sources: Richard Carrier, Robert Price, his name is Zengler. He's an atheist who has some bizarre views on the historical Jesus. Again, he doesn't cite mainstream guys like E.P. Saunders, Raymond Brown, guys that are esteemed in the field, right? Luke Timothy Johnson from Emory University. He doesn't cite those guys. He just cites these super fringe guys as if they're legitimate and seen as people that are really, especially Richard Carrier. Richard Carrier, his field is not historical Jesus studies. That's not his specific field. Okay, and he's a fringe view. Robert Price is a historical Jesus scholar, but he admits that his view is fringe. Okay, Rudolph Bultmann, who is not even he's no friend to evangelical conservative Christians, which I would consider myself to be, with lots of caveats in that. Bultmann called Jesus Mythicist, which Robert Price is, insane because the evidence is so stacked against their view. Jesus existed, and we can tell some core things about him and his ministry. He's not like Hercules. He's going to compare him to King Arthur earlier. It's just a joke. I mean, okay, let's work through his video here and what he's going to say, and I'm going to stop at the times when I want to comment.
And I'm not just talking about the other pre-Christian godmen that Jesus is apparently based on, although that is an important point too.
Jesus is based on other godmen. Who? AronRA? Who's he based off of? Mithra? Name them. You didn't name them. Osiris. All these guys. Guys, these pagan godmen, Jewish eschatological messianic thinkers, conservatives, which Paul definitely was, and Peter and these other early Christians, would never go to pagan myths to get their information about Jesus. It would not happen. It's as silly as saying the Muslim Brotherhood goes to Oprah to find spiritual insight, and they watch Oprah. It's not going to happen. Those early Jewish apostles of Jesus, the early Jewish Christians, okay, they were eschatological in mindset. They were thinking the end of the age is at hand. They would never go to pagan mythology. They would say that's blasphemous. Hercules and all these, and whoever you're talking about here, you don't name them. You don't name them in your video, which I would like to know who you think he's based off of. Where they went was to the Jewish scriptures. That's where they would have went if they were to find what they actually did. And scholars concede, the vast majority of scholars concede this because of the evidence. The events that happened in Jesus' life, they thought he was the Messiah, but they thought he was going to be a triumphant king who was going to come into Jerusalem and triumph. But then Jesus begins to tell them, hey, I'm going to die. He foreshadows his own death. Then after the bewildering events of the crucifixion, the early Christian, and then the events of the resurrection with the empty tomb, and then the encounters of Jesus in visions and all this, they went back to their scriptures and saw that the Messiah was supposed to die, according to Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, and a bunch of other Old Testament texts in Zechariah 12. That's what they did. Okay? They went back to their Jewish scriptures and said, oh, this is what, and then they did write the account of Jesus and citing those Old Testament prophecies saying that those were fulfilled here. Or they have it underlying and they put it in those terms. Okay? So for you to say that Jesus is based off of these other man gods, who? Okay, let's keep moving on here.
I'm talking about the most that I think we could expect of a historical Jesus. And I don't think that that would either qualify as historical or Jesus. In the very early years of Christianity, you already have factions arguing over whether Jesus is a real person.
Okay, here we go. He's gonna confuse time periods here and movements and heretical movements and all this. He's gonna do the standard thing that ignorant atheists do. Stupid, ignorant, foolish atheists do constantly that have not studied the field. He's going to bring in people like, he's going to confuse things that are going on in the 2nd century with what's happening in the 1st century, heretical movements that the early Christian church is dealing with. Even in the 3rd century, he's going to confuse with the first. It's just so laughable. So anyway, let's keep going on here.
The Ebionites or Nazarenes were a renunciate sect who held that Jesus was a purely human prophet. But they did not accept Paul's account of it, which is
That's true. They did not accept Paul. The Ebionites were early, but they were after the 1st generation. They had accepted the Gospel of Matthew and they rejected the virgin birth, but they did accept that Jesus died on the cross for our sins and the resurrection and that he was the Messiah and Lord. They did accept that. So that shows, since they reject the Gospel of Matthew, that shows they're after Matthew and they used a mangled Gospel of Matthew. Okay? Our earliest sources cite that. So that's, the Ebionites were Jewish Christians who rejected Paul, but they did think of Jesus as the Son of David and the Messiah dying for our sins.
Important here. Then you have the Docetics, who say that Jesus was a fully divine being who merely appeared to be human as an illusion. So Jesus is not a physical person and therefore can't really die.
So the Docetics, they came later on. Again, he's confusing things. In the 2nd generation, 3rd generation, 2nd century, the Docetics were an issue that were being dealt with in the 90s, and that's what Paul John in 1 John is dealing with. Those who deny that Jesus Christ came in the flesh are Antichrist or are false Christians, basically, is what he'll say in 1 John. Okay, so the Docetics, yes, but they're later than the 1st and 2nd generations. They're later. They're in the 90s. Okay, so they're coming after and they're being refuted by these texts, and especially Ignatius is really going to deal with Docetics and Gnostics, which he's going to confuse the two here in a second.
It happens in the celestial realm, which is what Richard Carrier suggests.
So Richard Carrier, there's this great scholar that he's going to cite, Richard Carrier, who, guys, Richard Carrier is a fringe kook amongst scholars and historians in this field. Okay? Think of Dr. Ken Ham in biology, me citing him, or me citing Dr. Kent Ovent with relation to geology or something like that. You would laugh. That's how so many people that are scholars in the field think of Richard Carrier. Robert Price is different, but even he recognizes he's a fringe view. So again, you're quoting a guy that nobody would take seriously in the field. They just would go, that guy, he's crazy. So let's keep on doing our real work over here.
Then you have the Gnostics, who are even older than Christianity, and they cast Jesus as an emissary between man and God. However,
the Gnostics were older. What are you talking about? Are you talking about the pre-Christian Gnostics here? See, again, he's confusing so many things here to make his point, to make it sound, it's deceptive, really. It's being deceptive. The Gnostics, the Christian Gnostics were later than the 1st generation of Christians. They were being dealt with the Docetists were a branch of Gnosticism. Okay, so they're an aspect of Gnosticism. There's a lot of intertwining there between the Docetists and the Gnostics. And the Gnostics were 2nd generation, and they had their own gospels. 2nd century. The Gnostics were really in full swing, full force in the 2nd century. That's when the early church is really having to deal with them. Read Ignatius, writing in 110. Read him. He's dealing with Gnostics. Okay, the first generation is dealing with more the Judaizing heresy, who believed the Gentiles needed to convert and become circumcised. That's a big issue there in the first generation. But even in the second, you can see there in the second generation, in the 90s, First John dealing with Docetists, who are the precursors to Gnostics, the Gnostics would be considered Docetists. They're very similar. They're intertwined like that. So again, him saying that the Gnostics are older, the Christian Gnostics are older than. Are you talking about? It's again, he's being deceptive here and leaving a lot of stuff out.
They did not believe that Jesus died for our sins, and that's a significant difference too. Then you've got the Coptic version, which again is early enough that it could be contemporary with the Gospel of John.
I want to know, where's this information where the Coptic Gospel is contemporary with John? Where's that evidence? The Coptic Gospel is contemporary with John. Where is your evidence for that? Nobody in the field thinks that. Nobody. So, and I would like to know what Coptic gospel you're referring to. There's a few. So anyway, let's move on here because it's going to get hilarious. Okay, so.
Their account includes the Gospel of Thomas, in which Jesus said that if God wanted men to be circumcised, then men wouldn't be born with foreskins.
The Gospel of Thomas is at the earliest in the early 2nd century, which is after John. John is in the 90s. Are you pushing John into the 2nd century, which most wouldn't do today? Most think John's in the 90s, and the earliest the Gospel of Thomas would be is in the early 2nd century, which would be 100 or probably an average of 115, 130 somewhere in there. That's where most would put the Gospel of Thomas. So anyway.
That rare bit of actual wisdom is part of the Nag Hammadi library, where God himself is oblivious to the fact that he was created by other gods in secrecy, and where Jesus is less important a character than their few different recurrent versions of Adam.
Those are Gnostics! The Nag Hammadi library are Gnostics. They're way after the earliest Christians, the Jewish Christians, and into the 2nd century. This is what I mean, guys. It's so laughable. You cannot make this stuff up, and it's going to get funnier here. Let's keep going on here.
Then there's the infancy gospel, contemporary with the Gospel of Luke, which tells the story of Jesus as.
The infancy gospel is contemporary with the Gospel of Luke. Which infancy gospel are you talking about? Okay, he's going to say it here. I think he's going to say it here in a second.
Boy, in that, young Jesus is more like Damien from The Omen, because he kills other children with incantations and brings clay figures to life with a golden.
Is he talking about the infancy gospel of Thomas? He's going to say that's contemporary with Luke. Guys, you cannot listen to this. Atheists out there, please do study. Don't listen to idiots like this that make statements like that. This is so laughable. The infancy gospel of Thomas is contemporary with Luke, who's writing in the 80s. The infancy gospel of Thomas, where Jesus, I don't know what to say to this. Look up infancy gospel of Thomas and see if it's contemporary with Luke, who's writing in the 80s. And check it out. Just check it out. And see why scholars believe Luke is writing in the 80s and Matthew is writing in the 80s. And why Gospel of Thomas is way later. Look it up yourselves. Okay? And actually that gospel got put into, sections of it anyway, got put into the Quran. And the Quran picked those up where Jesus turns these clay birds into real birds and stuff like that. So, this guy, it just makes me question all of what he says in all of his videos if he's making just bizarre statements like this. Okay, let's move on here.
Spell. Remember, this gospel was supposed to have preceded the Gospel of John. And what does that mean about the credibility of the Gospel of John? And look at all the disparity already. We've got 6.
The Gospel of Thomas precedes the Gospel of John. I can't face palm enough. The infancy Gospel of Thomas precedes the Gospel of John. Guys, this is It's just hilarious. Let's move on here.
15 non-canonical gospels emerging in the early days of Christianity, all of which purporting to tell the story of Jesus.
I think he said 15 non-canonical gospels emerging in the early days of Christianity. They're later than the 4. The earliest is Thomas in the early 2nd century. That's the earliest. All these others are 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. So again, is he mixing it all up? He's going to say, oh, and he did that with Noah, comparing Jesus with the stories of Jesus with Noah, saying that Noah was written 600 years after a guy in a boat was escaped from a flood in the Babylonian area. Mark is writing 30 years after. Paul's writing 20 years after, and has traditions of Jesus in his letters. So 14 non-canonical gospels are emerging in the early days. So 400 years is the early days of Jesus, I guess, to this guy. 300 to 400 years. Because some of them are so late. The Gospel of Mary, 2nd and 3rd century. These are so late. That's why the early Christians rejected them. Let's move on here.
Yet they're all different stories, and the early church banned them all as completely heretical.
It wasn't just because they were heretical. It's because they did not come from the apostolic community. And it was not authentic to the Jewish Jesus that was preserved in those Gospels. Okay? The human Jewish Jesus that is preserved in those Gospels, which is the context in which the early Jewish Christian emerged. It emerged from a Jewish context. These other Gospels are all Greek in orientation. They're Platonic. They're Hellenistic. They're totally Hellenistic. So to say this, it's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous.
The only Gospels which are canonized are the last one, which shouldn't be for obvious reasons, and the ones largely based on the first one. Even that first one was written decades after Jesus allegedly died, and it's missing important elements of his life, like the virgin birth. That was anonymously added later.
The virgin birth. Okay, so Matthew and Luke have the virgin birth. Okay, so scholars believe there was a story about a virgin birth that goes back way early. So Matthew and Luke are writing in the 80s, and that story of the virgin birth is contemporary to both, and they both have very different virgin birth stories. So that shows there was a virgin birth tradition that goes earlier than both of them. So Mark is writing at the latest 70, many think, probably in the mid-60s, actually, what most think, because of such the prevalence of Mark 13 and other internal evidence. But that's the main thing is Mark 13, and it's the climax of that gospel, but except for the Passion. So there's no mention even of Jesus' birth in Mark, because that was formed by the preaching. I believe this is a strong, some scholars contest this, but I believe there's strong evidence for this. This was formed by the preaching of Peter, who he knew from the baptism of Jesus all the way until his death and resurrection later. Okay? Now, the earliest tradition of Jesus, one of the earliest, we have in Romans chapter 1 that cites it being born the son of David, of the line of David, which shows that they did care about the birth of Jesus. Okay? And then Galatians chapter 4 talks about that as well, which some would consider a tradition, some wouldn't. But Romans 1 definitely cites the birth of Jesus being born of the son of David. So that's why the birth story went forward. The reason why Mark left it out wasn't because it wasn't important or because it was made up later, because we have an earlier tradition from Matthew and Luke that definitely goes back and makes Jesus virgin born earlier than the 80s at least. Probably goes way back even earlier than that. It's because Mark is based off of the preaching of Peter and the pericopes around his life, and so that's why Peter picks it up from Peter has Mark. Peter was there with Jesus from the baptism until his death and resurrection in the early church. So that's what's going on there. So to say, oh, he just leaves it out, it's confusing things.
The Gospel of Mark is 92% identical to Matthew, except that it corrects some of the errors that...
The Gospel of Mark corrects the errors of Matthew? Mark's written before Matthew. Little detail there. I don't know. Maybe he confused them. I'm not sure. Let's move it on.
Shouldn't have been in Matthew. And when it did not get corrected was chapter 1, verse 23. It's a misreading of Isaiah 7:14, as if that was supposed to be a prophecy pertaining to Jesus.
It's double prophecy.
Read the rest of that chapter.
We acknowledge there's
Isaiah was
double
talking about
prophecies.
another prophecy that was supposed to be fulfilled some 700 years earlier by some other perfectly ordinary bastard. That prophecy failed spectacularly too, but that's a rant for another time.
Do you know that?
Still in the first couple of centuries of Christianity, we have Justin Martyr, an early Christian apologist, telling Hellenist Greeks that Jesus is really no different than any other half-human god-man such as Hercules.
He's saying that not to say Jesus is just like them. He's saying that because the Christians are being pounded. They're being persecuted. So he's saying, hey, Jesus, you guys worship Hercules, which, of course, Justin Martyr thought that's completely a pagan, false son of God. He's saying that Jesus, we worship Jesus, who is a son of our God, the true God. Okay? And Justin Martyr would consider Jesus a historical figure, and Hercules was completely made up. So the parallel is to get the pagans to stop persecuting Christians. That's why he's saying that. It's like he's trying to connect with these pagans, going, hey, you guys worship him, we worship him. Just back off us, stop killing us. That's why he's saying that.
Now, we atheists understand that Jesus is not significantly different than the pagan god, but it's nice to see a Christian apologist admit that too.
What Christian apologist would admit that? I think it was his friend, or who would admit? Oh, he's talking about Justin Martyr. So Justin Martyr is saying, again, Justin Martyr is saying that to get the pagans to get off of him, not to say Jesus is just like these pagan myths. Let's move on here.
Also remember that there was never an historic origin for Hercules. Justin Martyr accepts as gospel the story of Jesus being strong like a giant to run his course around the world. Where the hell is that story? What was he reading back then? Where did any of these fanciful tales come from?
He's saying he's strong like a giant. I'm sure that's a metaphor that Justin Martyr, I don't know the citation he's talking about, but obviously a lot of Christians say Jesus is he's the greatest, man. They'll use all kinds of metaphors, even in Western society. We'll use all kinds of metaphors for Jesus, who he's like a rock. Does that mean he's literally a rock or something? No, he's probably using it as a metaphor, so I'm not sure what citation he's talking about. I have to look at the context of that.
So it implies that we have no idea how many different legends original Christianity was based on, or what those stories were even about, because they've been censored, hidden away, or destroyed.
You know that? You know that they were censored, hidden away, or destroyed. What's your evidence for that? How do you know that? Again, an atheist he's a liar. He's deceiving people and completely making stuff up here. How does he know that there was all this stuff censored and destroyed and all this? If it was destroyed, we wouldn't even have it. Where's your evidence that Again, people that claim to be so rational, these atheists, are so stupid. They're so illogical, so emotional based, so willing to make such false statements in an area that I've studied so much. And I know the field very well. And he's making these just preposterous statements, yet he claims to be this rational person, and Christians are so stupid. It's unbelievable. So, move on.
Even the early Christians had a very different concept of theology than we do today.
What? How do you know?
Certainly Jesus himself, if there was one, would have two.
Okay, this is his main thing, that Jesus would not approve of what happened. How do you know that? How do you know Jesus would not approve of what his earliest followers, Peter, James, John, the 12, and Paul, and these guys, how do you know that they would not have approved of what happened to him in the first and second generation? Those are the main texts that we have from the New Testament are from the first and second generation of Christians. You know better? You're a mind reader now. You know what Jesus thought. No, you're an ignorant fool who doesn't know the field at all, and you've just studied a tiny fringe group of guys, Richard Carrier, Robert Price, and Zingler, whoever that one guy is, that atheist guy, Zingler, Frank Zingler, I think his name is. You just studied this tiny fragment and just went on this rant here to give meat to other idiot atheists on YouTube who don't know any better either. So, anyway, please, honest atheists, don't accept this. This is so laughable, and it's a joke. He's claiming to be a mind reader as if he would know what Jesus thought. Jesus would not approve of what happened to him. You know that? Really? anyway, you know, I'm going to keep chronicling these to show you these rational atheists who claim to be only led by the evidence are nothing but. They are not led by the evidence. They're led by all these other factors and emotions and all this, and they're completely ignoring so much evidence, and they're completely ignoring their own presuppositions and bias. So anyway, we'll end there, and I hope this helped.